At the end of the 6th century AD, the peoples living on the northern shores of Scandinavia held a faith that had been forged over centuries. Their perceptions of the world, the gods, and human destiny were not built upon abstract philosophical constructs, but rather on the harsh realities of northern nature. The Vikings, Norwegians, Danes, and Swedes created a unique mythological system that reflected their view of the universe's structure. This system was not recorded immediately. It was passed down orally through the poetry of skalds and through sagas told by the hearth during long winter evenings. It was only in the 13th century that the Icelandic poet and historian Snorri Sturluson recorded these legends in his time's Prose Edda, creating a source that became the foundation of our understanding of Norse mythology. Without his work, many details of this faith would have been lost forever. Norse mythology was not a unified dogmatic system. Different tribes and regions had their own variations of stories and different emphases in the worship of gods. However, there were common concepts that united all the northern Germanic peoples. At the center of their cosmology stood the world tree, Yggdrasil, a giant ash that connected the 9 worlds. This tree was not merely a symbol, but a living cosmic axis permeating all levels of existence. Its roots stretched into the underworld. The trunk passed through Midgard, the world of humans, and its crown touched the heavenly halls of the gods. Sacred springs flowed at its roots, and its leaves were fed upon by deer and goats whose milk turned into honeyed dew. The tree suffered constantly. The dragon Nidhogg gnawed at its roots from below, deer grazed on its bark, and the squirrel Ratatoskr ran constantly along the trunk, carrying insults between the dragon and the eagle at the top. The 9 worlds, connected by Yggdrasil, formed the complete picture of the universe. Asgard was the world of the Aesir gods, located high in the crown of the tree. Here stood golden halls where Odin, the supreme god, ruled. Vanaheim belonged to the Vanir, another group of deities who were more ancient and linked to fertility. Alfheim was inhabited by light elves, being similar to the elves in later traditions. Midgard was the world of humans, located in the center of the cosmos, and surrounded by an ocean in which the world serpent, Jormungandr, lay. Jotunheim belonged to the giants, Jotuns, the primordial forces of chaos. Svartalfheim was the land of the dark elves, or dwarves, who were skilled blacksmiths. Helheim, or simply Hel, was the kingdom of the dead, where those who died of illness or old age ended up. Niflheim was the primordial world of ice and mist. Muspelheim was the world of fire, where the fire giants dwelled. The creation of this universe began with a void. At the beginning of time, there existed Ginnungagap, the cosmic abyss, a yawning chasm between 2 primordial worlds. On one side lay Niflheim, the source of cold, from which flowed the poisonous rivers known as the Alivigar. On the other side was Muspelheim, the realm of flame, ruled by the fire giant Surtur. When the streams of ice from Niflheim met the heat from Muspelheim, creation began in Ginnungagap. From the ice thawing under the breath of fire, the first living organism emerged, the giant Ymir. He was a hermaphrodite, capable of producing offspring independently. While Ymir slept, a man and a woman were born from the sweat under his left arm, and his legs produced a 6-headed son. Thus began the race of frost giants, the Rimthurs. Simultaneously with Ymir, the cow Audhumla appeared from the melting ice. She licked the salty ice blocks, finding sustenance. From these blocks emerged the first god, Buri. His name meant producer or parent. Buri fathered a son, Bor, who married the giantess Bestla, daughter of the giant Bolthorn. From this union were born 3 brothers, Odin, Vili, and Vi. These 3 gods began a new era. They rose up against Ymir and killed him. From the body of the first giant, the brothers created the entire visible world. From his flesh, they made the earth. From his bones, the mountains. From his teeth and fragments of bone, the rocks and boulders. Ymir's blood became the seas and lakes. There was so much of it that almost all the frost giants drowned in the flood, except for Bergelmir and his wife, who escaped on a wooden ark. The brothers raised Ymir's skull above the earth to create the firmament, which was supported by 4 dwarves, Nordri, Sudri, Ostri, and Vestri, whose names corresponded to the 4 cardinal directions. They scattered the giant's brain across the sky, and it became clouds. From the sparks and embers of Muspelheim, the gods created the sun, moon, and stars, establishing their paths across the sky. The sun was driven across the sky by the maiden Sol on a chariot drawn by the horses Arvak and Alsvid. Chasing her forever was the wolf Skoll, trying to swallow the luminary. The moon was ruled by Sol's brother, Mani, and he was also hunted by the wolf Hati. The Vikings believed that during eclipses, the wolves almost caught their prey, and people needed to make noise to scare away the monsters. When the end of the world, Ragnarok, arrives, the wolves will finally catch and swallow the sun and moon, and eternal darkness will fall. After creating the earth and sky, the gods organized the world. They established the boundaries of the ocean, which encircled the earth. In this ocean they placed the world serpent Jormungandr, so large that he could coil around the entirety of Midgard and bite his own tail. The land of humans was created from Ymir's eyelashes, which formed a protective wall, hence the name Midgard, which means middle enclosure. Beyond this enclosure lay the dangerous Utgard, the outer world where giants and other hostile beings dwelled. The gods themselves built their fortress, Asgard, high above Midgard. These two worlds were connected by the rainbow bridge Bifrost, guarded by the god Heimdall. This bridge was strong, but on the day of Ragnarök, it would collapse under the weight of the army of fire giants. After creating the worlds, the gods found two trees on the seashore, an ash and an elm. From these, Odin and his brothers created the first humans. Odin granted them breath and life. Vili gave them reason and movement. V gave them appearance, speech, hearing, and sight. The first man was named Ash, and the first woman Embla, perhaps meaning elm or vine. From this pair, the entire human race descended. The gods did not leave humans without protection. They gave them laws, taught them crafts, and gifted them runes for writing and magic. However, the fate of each human was determined not only by the gods. There were three Norns Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld goddesses of Fadi, who sat at the well of Urd, at the roots of Yggdrasil. They spun the threads of life for all beings, and even the gods could not change what the Norns had inscribed. The world created by the gods was not static. It was constantly changing, struggling, and evolving. The main event in the early history of the gods was the war between the Aesir and the Vanir, two tribes of deities. This war was not just a mythological metaphor. It reflected real cultural processes in Scandinavia, where different religious traditions were mixing. The Aesir represented the gods of war, power, wisdom, and social order. The Vanir were gods of fertility, wealth, peace, and natural forces. The conflict between them ended not with the victory of one side, but with a truce, an exchange of hostages, and the creation of a unified pantheon. It was this synthesis of two divine lineages that defined the character of the Norse religion, which combined martial prowess and agrarian magic, the thirst for glory, and the desire for prosperity. Norse gods were not immortal in the absolute sense. They aged, could be wounded, and even killed. Their eternal youth was maintained by the golden apples of the goddess Idun. Every day, the goddess brought the magical fruits from her box, and the gods ate them to preserve their strength and beauty. When the giant Thjazi once kidnapped Idun, the gods began to age rapidly. Their skin wrinkled, their hair turned gray, and their strength left them. Only after the cunning Loki returned Idun to Asgard did the gods regain their youth. This story showed the Norse that even divine power has its limits, and that the order of the world rests on a fragile balance that can be disrupted at any moment. Such a perception of the gods was close to the harsh realities of Viking life, where survival depended on constant struggle, and where even the strongest could fall before the face of hostile forces of nature or men. Odin occupied a central place in the Norse pantheon, although his cult was not the most widespread among the common people. He bore a multitude of names. Sources preserve over 200 of his epithets, each revealing a new facet of his essence. All, Father Times. All, Fodor, Father of the Slain Times. Valfodr, he who dispensed justice foi. Hopt, Creator of ills. Bolverk, the Masked One. Grimnir, the Creator. Gautri. Such an abundance of names reflected the multifaceted nature of the supreme god. Odin was the god of war, but not of blind fury. He patronized strategy, cunning, and magic. He was the god of poetry and runes, seeking wisdom at any cost. He was the god of the dead, the ruler of Valhalla, where warriors who fell in battle were taken. His cult required sacrifices, both of animals and, In certain cases, humans. The physical appearance of Odin is described in numerous sagas. He was depicted as a tall elder with a long gray beard, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a blue cloak. His main characteristic was his single eye. He had sacrificed the other for the right to drink from Mimir's well, which granted him the deepest wisdom. This act of self-sacrifice showed that even the supreme god paid a high price for knowledge. Odin constantly wandered through the worlds in search of wisdom, often in the guise of a simple traveler. He would come to humans, giants, and dwarves, questioning them, testing them, and observing. He was accompanied by two ravens, Hugin and Munin, whose names meant thought and memory. Every morning the ravens flew across all worlds and brought Odin news of everything that happened. Two wolves, Jerry and Freki, greedy and voracious, sat at his throne. Odin fed them all the food from his table, while he himself consumed only wine. Odin's main attribute was the spear Gungnir, forged by the skilled dwarves, the sons of Ivaldi. This weapon never missed its mark, and always returned to its owner's hand. At the start of a battle, Vikings would throw a spear over the heads of their enemies, dedicating them to Odin and invoking his blessing. Another important artifact was the golden bracelet or ring Draupnir, also created by the dwarves. Every 9th night, 8 new rings of equal weight and purity would drip from this ring, symbolizing inexhaustible wealth. Odin owned the 8-legged horse Sleipnir, the fastest steed in all worlds, capable of galloping across the sky, over the sea, and even into the realm of the dead. Sleipnir was the son of Loki, who had transformed into a mare, and the giant stallion Svedilfari. This is one of the strangest stories in Norse mythology. The acquisition of wisdom was Odin's primary goal. In addition to sacrificing his eye for the right to drink from Mimir's well, he underwent an even more terrible trial. To comprehend the mystery of the runes, ancient symbols possessing magical power, Odin sacrificed himself to himself. For 9 days and 9 nights, he hung on the world tree Yggdrasil, pierced by his own spear, without food or water. The wind rocked his body, ravens tore at his flesh, but he did not utter a sound. On the 9th day, at the edge of death, he saw the runes inscribed at the roots of the tree, and, with a cry, grasped them. At that moment, the rope broke, and he fell. But the knowledge was gained. The runes became his greatest gift. They were used not only for writing but also for divination, spells, curses, and blessings. Each rune carried an entire layer of meanings. Odin was the patron of the skalds, poets, and singers whose art was highly valued in Norse society. The origin of poetic mastery is linked to the myth of the mead of poetry. After the war between the Aesir and Vanir, the gods of both sides spat into a vessel as a sign of agreement. From this saliva, the wisest man, Kvasir, was created. He knew the answer to any question. 2 malicious dwarves, Fjalar and Galar, invited Kvasir over and killed him. They mixed his blood with honey and obtained a beverage that granted the gift of poetry. After a series of murders and deceptions, this mead fell into the hands of the giant Suttungr, who hid it in a mountain under the protection of his daughter, Gunnlod. Odin penetrated the mountain, seduced Gunnlod, spent 3 nights with her, and drank all the mead of poetry. Then he transformed into an eagle and flew to Asgard, pursued by the enraged Suttungr. Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, was Odin's main possession in Asgard. It was a massive hall with 540 gates, through each of which 800 warriors could pass simultaneously. Its roof was covered with shields instead of tiles, and the rafters were made of spears. Here, Odin sent his warrior maidens, the Valkyries, to choose the slain, to take the souls of warriors who fell in battle the times Einherjar. The Valkyries descended to the battlefield in full armor, and whomever they touched would die and ascend to Valhalla. There, the Einherjar spent their days fighting one another, perfecting their combat skills. By evening, all wounds healed and the dead were resurrected. At night, the warriors feasted, eating the meat of the boar Saehrimnir, who was resurrected every day, and drinking mead from horns offered by the Valkyries. This was the warriors' paradise. Eternal battle and eternal feasting. However, not all the fallen ended up in Valhalla. Only those who died with weapons in their hands could claim it. The others went to Helheim, the kingdom of the goddess Hel, daughter of Loki. This was not a place of punishment in the Christian sense, but it was not a paradise either, just a gray, dull existence for shadows. Women who died in childbirth went to the goddess Freyja in her hall, Folkvangr, where she ruled over half the fallen. This was her share by agreement with Odin. The drowned belonged to the sea giant Aegir and his wife, Ran. Such a plurality of afterlives showed that Norse religion recognized different destinies for different people depending on the circumstances of their death. Death in battle was considered the most honorable, not because of Viking cruelty, but because a warrior who fell for his cause had fulfilled his destiny worthily. Odin gathered warriors in Valhalla not for idleness. He was preparing an army for Ragnarok, the end of the world, when all the forces of chaos would rise against the gods. On that day, giants, monsters, and the dead would unite and move on Asgard. Odin knew that this day was inevitable. He had received a prophecy from a dead vulva, Cirrus, whom he had summoned from the grave using necromancy. She told him of all the events of Ragnarök, of the death of the gods, and the destruction of the worlds. Odin knew that he himself would fall in battle, swallowed by the monstrous wolf Fenrir. But he could not change destiny. The Norns had predetermined everything. All that Odin could do was gather as many warriors as possible so that the gods would fight worthily, even if defeat was inevitable. This concept of destiny, which cannot be avoided but can be met with honor, was key to the Norse worldview. The relations of Odin with other gods were complex. He was the father of many of them: Thor, Balder, Vidar, Vali, Hod, and others. His wife was Frigg, the goddess of marriage and motherhood. But Odin had liaisons with giantesses and goddesses. From the giantess Jord, Thor was born. From Rindr, Vali. Despite his position as the supreme god, Odin often acted through deception and cunning, which caused dissatisfaction among more straightforward gods, especially Thor. Their relationship was ambiguous. Thor respected his father but did not always approve of his methods. Odin saw in Thor the necessary strength of a defender of gods and humans but considered him insufficiently wise. This tension reflected the difference between two types of power: the intellectual, magical power of Odin, and the physical, direct power of Thor. Both were necessary to maintain order in the world. The cult of Odin was common primarily among the nobility, kings, earls, and warrior retinues. Kings of Scandinavian countries traced their lineages to Odin, calling themselves Ynglings, descendants of Yngvi Freyr via Odin. Odin was the patron of warrior brotherhoods and secret societies of times berserkers, times furious warriors who entered a combat trance before battle. These warriors believed that Odin gave them superhuman strength and insensitivity to pain. They bit their shields, howled like beasts, rushed into battle without armor, and fought with a fury that terrified their enemies. It was believed that berserkers were under the direct protection of Odin, and that they could not be wounded unless the god withdrew his favor. Archaeological findings confirm the existence of such warriors. Graves have been found containing remains of people with multiple battle wounds, buried with special honors and amulets dedicated to Odin. If Odin was the god of kings and poets, Thor was the patron of the common people, farmers, craftsmen, and seafarers. His cult was the most widespread in Scandinavia, especially in Norway and Iceland. Thor was the god of thunder, storms, and fertility. Claps of thunder were considered the sound of his chariot as he raced across the sky, and lightning were sparks from his hammer, Mjolnir. Unlike the cunning and unpredictable Odin, Thor was straightforward, honest, and reliable. He did not build complex intrigues and did not resort to magic for deception. He solved problems with strength. That is precisely why common people loved him more than other gods. They knew they could rely on Thor, that he would not betray or deceive them, and would always come to the aid of those in need. Thor was described as a massive man with a red beard and hair, physically the strongest of all the Aesir. His eyes burned like coals, and when he was angry, even giants shuddered at his gaze. Thor possessed three main artifacts. The first was the hammer Mjolnir, the most famous weapon in Norse mythology. This hammer was forged by the dwarf brothers Sindri and Brokkr and possessed amazing properties. It always hit its target and returned to Thor's hand like a boomerang. It could shrink to the size of an amulet, which the god hid in his tunic, and grow back to full size at the owner's will. The only flaw of Mjolnir was the short handle, a result of the tricks of Loki, who turned into a fly and bothered the dwarves during the forging. Despite this, the hammer was an invincible weapon. The second artifact was the Belt of Strength, Jord. When Thor wore this belt, his already colossal strength was doubled. No one except Thor could lift Mjolnir, but even he needed all his power, amplified by the belt, to use the hammer to its full potential. The third item was the iron gloves, Jarngriper, necessary to hold the red-hot handle of the hammer. Without these gloves, Thor could not have used his main weapon. All three artifacts were made by the dwarves, skilled smiths who lived underground. The dwarves created all the best things for the gods but demanded a high price. Brothers Sindri and Brokr made these items at the request of Loki, who had wagered his head with the Aesir and was trying to pay his debt with miraculous gifts. Thor lived in Thrudvangur, a region of Asgard, where his massive hall, Bilskirnir, stood the largest building in the world of the gods. It had 540 rooms and was a residence worthy of the greatest warrior. Thor's wife was the golden-haired Sif, the goddess of fertility. Her hair of pure gold was once cut off by Loki in a malicious prank, and Thor had to force the dwarves to create new hair for her out of real gold that grew like living hair. Thor had 3 children, a daughter, Thrud, and sons, Magni and Modi. Magni, whose name meant strong, and Modi, brave, were destined to survive Ragnarok and inherit Mjolnir after their father's death. These young gods symbolized the hope for rebirth after the end of the world. Thor traveled in a chariot drawn by 2 goats, Tangrisnir Gaptooth and Tangjostur, Toothgrinder. These goats could race across the sky and through the air, crossing any distance with great speed. An amazing property of these animals was their ability to be resurrected. When Thor stopped to rest, he would kill and cook the goats to feed himself and his companions. But if the bones were placed on the goatskins and Thor blessed them with Mjolnir, the goats would come back to life in the morning. Once, a peasant's son, Thjalfi, who was traveling with Thor, broke a bone to get at the marrow. In the morning, one of the goats came back to life lame. An enraged Thor nearly killed the youth but forgave him, taking Thjalfi and his sister, Roskva, as his eternal servants. Thor's main occupation was protecting Asgard and Midgard from giants. The Jotuns constantly threatened the gods and humans. It was Thor who time and again went to Jotunheim to fight them. The number of giants killed by his hammer was uncountable. Many stories about his expeditions survive in the sagas. One of the most famous episodes is Thor's journey to the giant Utgarda Loki. Thor, along with Loki and the servants Thjalfi and Roskva, set off to Jotunheim to prove his superiority. At the fortress of Utgard, the giant Utgarda Loki proposed trials. Loki was to outeat anyone, Thjalfi was to win a foot race, and Thor was to win 3 contests: drain a drinking horn, lift a cat, and wrestle an old woman. They all failed. Loki ate quickly, but his opponent, Logi, devoured not only the meat but also the bones and the wooden dish itself. Thjalfi ran faster than the wind, but Hugi outran him so quickly that he returned before Thjalfi finished. Thor could not drain the horn, even though he drank with all his might. He barely lifted one paw of the cat, even though he exerted all his strength. In wrestling with the old woman, Ellie, he was forced onto one knee. Utgarda Loki released the humiliated gods with a sneer, but when they were far from the fortress, the giant called out to them and revealed the truth. Loki had competed against fire, which consumes everything. Thjalfi had run against thought, faster than which nothing exists. The horn from which Thor drank was connected to the world ocean, and the god had managed to lower its level, creating the tides. The cat was, in fact, the world serpent, Jormungandr, whom Thor had nearly dragged out of the ocean. The old woman, Ellie, was old age, which no one can conquer. Thor, in a rage, hurled Mjolnir at Utgarda Loki, but the giant and his fortress vanished, dissolving into the air like a mirage. This story showed that even the greatest strength has limits, and that giants possess sorcery that can deceive even gods. Thor hated deception and magic precisely because they deprived him of his main advantage, direct power. However, he did have a victory over the serpent Jormungandr in another campaign. Thor set off to the giant Hymir disguised as a youth and asked to be taken fishing. Hymir agreed with a sneer, not knowing who was before him. At sea, Thor baited his hook with an ox head and cast his line. The world serpent itself took the bait. Thor began to pull, and the monster surfaced closer and closer. The god had already raised his hammer to kill the serpent, but the terrified Hymir cut the fishing line, and Jormungandr retreated back into the abyss. Mjolnir was not only a weapon of war but also a sacred symbol. Its images were used as amulets for protection against evil. Marriages, births, and new homes were blessed with the hammer. Vikings wore small hammers on their necks. Thousands of such findings have been made by archaeologists all over Scandinavia. When Christianization began in the 10th century, Thor's hammer became a symbol of resistance to the new faith. Pagans demonstratively wore hammers, contrasting them with Christian crosses. Some findings show combined amulets where the hammer transitions into a cross, a testament to the transition period when the old and new religions coexisted. The cult of Thor proved to be the most persistent among Scandinavian deities. His worship continued in remote areas as late as the 11th century, 200 years after official conversion. Thor represented not only strength, but also fertility. The thunder and rain he brought were necessary for the harvest. Peasants prayed to Thor for good weather, abundant rains at the right time, and the protection of fields from hail. In his honor, ritual feasts were held where sacrificial meat was shared among all members of the community. One temple of Thor in Iceland, described in the sagas, had a pillar with an image of a hammer, which was considered so sacred that all the most important oaths were sworn upon it. To break an oath given on the pillar of Thor meant to bring the wrath of the god himself upon one's head. Such pillars, often parts of columns from the high seat of a chieftain, were taken by settlers when they sailed to Iceland. They would throw them overboard as they approached the island, and where the pillar washed ashore, they would found their homestead. In addition to the Aesir, there existed another tribe of gods, the Vanir. They were more ancient than the Aesir, and more closely linked to the forces of nature, fertility, wealth, and magic. Two main Vanir, Freyja and Freyja, were brother and sister, the children of the sea god Njord. After the war between the Aesir and Vanir, these three moved to Asgard as hostages, symbolizing peace between the divine tribes. In exchange, the Aesir sent the god Hoenir, and the wisest of all, Mimir, to the Vanir. However, this exchange ended in tragedy. The Vanir discovered that Hoenir was completely useless without Mimir. He could not make decisions. Enraged by the deception, they cut off Mimir's head and sent it back to Asgard. Odin preserved the head with herbs and sorcery, and it continued to give advice. Odin kept Mimir's head at the Well of Wisdom and consulted it on the most important matters. Frey was the god of fertility, peace, and prosperity. His name literally meant Lord. Frey was honored primarily as the provider of the harvest, wealth, and peaceful life. People prayed to him for good weather, a bountiful harvest, the fertility of livestock, and success in trade. Frey ruled the rains and sunlight. Whether the year would be fruitful or hungry depended on him. In Sweden, the cult of Freyr was particularly strong. The royal dynasty called themselves Ynglings, tracing their origin back to Freyr, who was also called Yngvi Freyr. The main sanctuary of Freyr was in Uppsala, where stood wooden idols of the three main gods, Odin, Thor, and Freyr. The Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan, who visited the lands of the Scandinavians in the 10th century, described huge wooden statues with exaggerated sexual features, which corresponded to Freyr's functions as a god of fertility. Freyr possessed several miraculous items. The main one was the ship times Skidbladnir times the fastest ship in the world, which always had a favorable wind in its sails. An amazing property of Skidbladnir was its ability to fold down to the size of a handkerchief, which could be carried in a pocket. When necessary, the ship would unfold back to size and could accommodate all the Aesir with weapons and armor. This ship was forged by the same dwarves, the sons of Ivaldi, who created the hair for Sif and the spear Gungnir for Odin. The second treasure of Freyr was the boar Gullinbursti, golden bristles. This boar was forged by the brothers Sindri and Broker out of gold. Its bristles glowed in the dark brighter than any torch, and it ran faster than the best horse on land, water, and even through the air. On this boar, Freyr raced across the sky, and its golden glow was taken for the dawn. The third treasure was a sword that fought by itself as soon as it was drawn. Freyr gave this sword away as a ransom for his bride. The story of his love for the giantess Gerdur is told in the Eddic poem, Time Skirnir's Journey. Once Freyr sat on Odin's throne, Hlidskjalf, from which all the worlds could be seen. His gaze fell on Jotunheim, and there he saw the beautiful maiden Gerdur, daughter of the giant Gymir. When she raised her hands to open the door to her father's house, the light from her snow-white arms illuminated the sky and sea. Freyr fell in love so deeply that he grew ill with longing. His servant, Skirnir, volunteered to travel to Gerdur and woo her for his master. Freyr gave him his horse, and that very sword that fought by itself. Skirnir embarked on a dangerous journey through the ring of fire surrounding Gymir's house. Skirnir offered Gerdur 11 golden apples and the ring Draupnir if she would agree to become Freyr's wife. Gerdur refused. Then Skirnir threatened to cut off her head with his master's sword. Gerdur was not afraid, stating that her father would kill anyone who harmed her. Finally, Skirnir resorted to the most terrible thing. the magic of runes. He inscribed a curse. Gerdur would live on the edge of the world among the dead, would never know joy, would wither from desire like a thistle plucked in autumn. She would be tormented by hunger, madness, and eternal despair. Only then did Gerdur surrender and agree to meet Freyr after 9 nights in the grove of Barry. When Skirnir returned with this news, Freyr exclaimed, "Long is one night, 2 or even longer. How can I endure 3? Often, a month has seemed shorter than this half-night of passion." This myth showed that even gods are not free from the torments of love. Freyja, Frey's sister, was the goddess of love, beauty, war, and magic. Her name simply meant lady. She was the most beautiful of the goddesses, and she was desired by all gods, giants, and dwarves. She wept tears of red gold when her husband, odd a mysterious figure, possibly one of Odin's hypostases, went on long wanderings and disappeared. Freyja possessed a falcon feather cloak, and by wearing it, one could fly. She lent it to other gods when a fast journey was required. Loki repeatedly took this plumage for his adventures. Freyja traveled in a chariot drawn by 2 cats, enormous animals capable of pulling her across the sky. Cats were considered sacred animals of Freyja, and women who kept cats were under her patronage. Freyja's main treasure was the necklace Brisingamen, a piece of jewelry of incredible beauty that shone brighter than the sun. This necklace was created by 4 dwarves, Alfrig, Dvalin, Berlinger, and Grer. Freyja saw it in their workshop underground and wanted to buy it at any cost. The dwarves refused to sell it for gold. Their price was this. Freyja had to spend 1 night with each of them. The goddess agreed. So strongly did she desire the necklace. She spent 4 nights with the dwarves, and on the 5th morning, she received Brisingamen. This episode was used by Christian authors to condemn pagan gods, but in the pagan tradition itself, it contained no moral judgment. The gods had the right to act as they saw fit. Freyja was not only a goddess of love but also of war. She rode into battle and took half the fallen warriors to her hall, Folkvanger, Field of Warriors. This right she gained even before Odin created Valhalla, and he could not revoke it. It was believed that Freyja chose the most valiant, those who fought not only for glory but for the protection of their loved ones. Her warriors continued to serve her in the afterlife. Freyja possessed a special magic, cider times a form of sorcery linked to divination, influencing fate, and changing reality. This type of magic was considered feminine, and men practicing cider times were held in contempt, as it was considered unworthy of a warrior. Even Odin, who also practiced cider times after learning it from Freyja, endured mockery for it. Njord, the father of Freyr and Freyja, was the god of the sea, wind, and wealth. He was invoked by seafarers, merchants, and fishermen. Njord lived in Noatun, a ship haven by the sea. His marriage to the giantess Skadi was unsuccessful due to their different lifestyles. Skadi was the daughter of the giant Thiazi, whom the gods killed for kidnapping Idun and her apples of youth. As compensation, the gods allowed Skadi to choose a husband from among them, but on the condition that she must choose by looking only at their feet. Skadi wanted to choose the beautiful Balder, and when she saw the cleanest and most beautiful feet, she decided it was him. But it turned out to be Njord. His feet were white and clean from sea foam and water. Skadi had to accept her choice and marry him. The marriage brought no happiness to either spouse. Skadi loved the mountains, snow, and hunting in wild forests. Njord could not live far from the sea. They tried to find a compromise. 9 nights in Skadi's mountain home, Thrymheim, and 9 nights in Njord's sea home, Noatun. But Njord could not sleep from the howling of wolves in the mountains, and Skadi could not bear the cries of seagulls by the sea. In the end, they separated. Skadi returned to her mountains, where she hunted on skis with a bow, and Njord remained by the shore. No children were born from this marriage. Freyr and Freyja were born from Njord's first marriage with an unknown wife, possibly his own sister, which was acceptable among the Vanir but forbidden among the Aesir. This story showed that even gods cannot always overcome their nature, and that love requires not only attraction but a shared lifestyle. The cult of the Vanir was closely linked to agrarian cycles, the changing of seasons, and the harvest. Festivities were held in their honor at key moments of the year. In spring to ensure a good planting season, in summer for crop growth, and in autumn in gratitude for the harvested grain. Sacrifices to the Vanir included the first fruits of the harvest, milk, honey, and sometimes animals. Especially important was the sacrifice of a boar, the sacred animal of Freyr, during festivals in honor of the Vanir. Much beer and mead were drunk, and feasts were held where the entire community gathered. These festivities had an orgiastic character, which scandalized later Christian chroniclers. Adam of Bremen, writing in the 11th century, described with horror pagan rites in Uppsala where not only blood sacrifices were performed but also rituals related to fertility. The war between the Aesir and Vanir, which ended in their unification, had a deep meaning. It reflected the clash of two types of society and worldview. The Aesir represented the warrior aristocracy, the patriarchal order, and organized power. The Vanir embodied a more ancient connection to nature, fertility cults, and, perhaps, remnants of matriarchy. The war began because of a vulva named Gullveig, gold drunk or power of gold, who came to the Aesir and demanded gold. The Aesir tried to kill her 3 times by throwing her into a fire, but she was reborn every time. Then the war began. The Vanir attacked Asgard and destroyed its walls. The Aesir responded by invading the lands of the Vanir. Neither side could win decisively. Peace was concluded on equal terms. Both sides exchanged hostages, and the gods mingled, forming a single pantheon. This alliance symbolized the need for balance between war and peace, between conquest and creation, between the masculine and feminine principles. The Aesir brought order, law, and martial skill. The Vanir brought fertility, wealth, and magical knowledge. Only together could they maintain the harmony of the universe. Historically, this myth could reflect the real fusion of two religious traditions, the Indo-European cult of war gods and a more ancient, possibly pre-Indo-European cult of nature deities. Archaeological data show that in the early period in Scandinavia, different forms of burial rites and religious practices existed, which eventually synthesized. The Vanir brought the Aesir knowledge of time cider times magic that allowed one to see the future, influence the weather, send illnesses or heal, create love or evoke hatred. This magic required an altered state of consciousness, a trance achieved through special incantations and ritual actions. A practitioner of time cider times would sit on a high platform, surrounded by helpers who sang special songs. In a trance, the practitioner's soul would embark on a journey through the worlds, where it received knowledge of the future or influenced events. Cider times was considered times ergi times, unmanly, dishonorable. For a man, as it required a passive, receptive role that was associated with the feminine principle. A man practicing times cider times became an object of contempt and mockery. Even Odin, the greatest of the gods, endured reproaches for this from other Aesir. The cult of Freyja was especially popular among women. She was invoked in matters of love and for protection during childbirth. Many women became priestesses of Freyja, practiced times cider, and were seeresses. Such women were called times vulvas times or times spaewives. They wandered from farmstead to farmstead, and were invited to feasts where they performed divinations for the whole community. Archaeological findings confirm the existence of such priestesses. In some female burials, special staves with metal finials are found, which are interpreted as attributes of vulvas. One such burial was discovered in Denmark. The woman was buried with a rich inventory including silver jewelry, a staff, and a bowl with hemp seeds, possibly used to reach a trance. Freyr and Freyja were closely linked to royal power. Many Scandinavian dynasties traced their descent to Freyr. The Swedish Ynglings considered him their ancestor. Royal power in Scandinavia had not only a political but also a sacred character. The king, konung, was responsible for the prosperity of the country, for the harvest, and for peace. If lean years, famine, or epidemics occurred, it meant that the king had lost the blessing of the gods. In such cases, he could be sacrificed. The most famous case is that of King Domaldi, whom the Swedes sacrificed to Freyr during a 3-year famine. After this, the harvests returned. This practice of ritual regicide had parallels in many nations and reflected the view of the king as the embodiment of the earth's fertility. Sacred places of the Vanir were often located near springs, groves, or large stones. Unlike the cult of the Aesir, which required organized sanctuaries with idols and sacrificial altars, the worship of the Vanir was more informal. People left offerings at sacred trees and threw valuable objects into lakes and swamps. Archaeologists have discovered thousands of valuable items in the peat bogs of Scandinavia and Denmark: weapons, jewelry, cauldrons that were sacrificed to water spirits. Some bogs contained entire hoards, the results of collective sacrifices after successful campaigns or in gratitude for deliverance from danger. This tradition persisted until the late Middle Ages. Despite Christianization, the connection of the Vanir to the sea and seafaring was especially important for the Vikings. Njord was invoked before beginning a voyage to pray for a favorable wind, calm sea, and success in trade. Freyja was asked for wealth from trading expeditions. Viking ships were often decorated with symbols related to the Vanir, images of boars or spirals symbolizing waves. The figureheads of times dragon ships, in the form of dragons or snakes, were intended to scare away evil spirits. But when a ship approached its home shores, these figures were removed, so as not to scare away the benevolent spirits of the land, the Landvatir times, who were also under the patronage of the Vanir. Icelandic law even prescribed the removal of dragon heads when approaching the shore, so as not to offend the island spirits. Among the Aesir stood out a figure who did not fit into the general picture of divine order. Loki was the son of the giant Farbauti and the giantess Laufey, but he lived among the Aesir as a blood brother to Odin. According to Eddic poems, Odin and Loki had mingled their blood in ancient times, swearing to be brothers. Since then, Loki had the right to sit at the gods' feasts, and he could not be banished as long as Odin lived. Loki was the god of fire, cunning, deception, and change. His nature was dualistic. He constantly helped the gods but also created problems for them. Most of the troubles that befell Asgard were directly or indirectly caused by Loki, but he was also the one who found a way out of the most hopeless situations. Without Loki, the Aesir would not have received many of their treasures, but because of him, they nearly perished several times. Loki's appearance was described as attractive but with cunning, mocking features. He was eloquent, witty, and capable of convincing anyone of anything. Loki possessed the ability to change form, turning into animals, birds, fish, and even other people or gods. This ability to transform symbolized his changeable, unreliable nature. He had no permanent home in Asgard. He wandered, appeared suddenly, and vanished just as quickly. His wife was Sigyn, a faithful and devoted goddess, who remained with him even after his greatest crime and punishment. From Sigyn, Loki had 2 sons, Nari and Narvi, ordinary gods. But from the giantess Angrboda, who lived in the Iron Wood, Loki sired 3 monsters who became the greatest threats to the gods. The first of these monsters was the wolf Fenrir, enormous and ferocious. When the gods learned of his birth, they brought the wolf cub to Asgard, hoping to tame him. Only Tyr, the god of war and justice, dared to feed Fenrir. The wolf grew at an incredible speed, becoming ever larger and more dangerous. The gods realized they had to bind him, otherwise he would destroy everything. Twice they tried to chain Fenrir with ordinary chains. The first chain was called Times Lading, the second Times Dromi. Each was stronger than the last. Fenrir agreed to be chained, thinking it a test of strength. Both times, he broke the shackles without difficulty. Then Odin sent Skirnir to Svartalfheim to the dwarf masters. The dwarves created the magical ribbon times Gleipnir, times from 6 impossible things: the sound of a cat's footsteps, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the tendons of a bear, the breath of a fish, and the spittle of a bird. Gleipnir was as thin as a silk ribbon, soft to the touch, but absolutely unbreakable. The gods again suggested that Fenrir test his strength. The wolf suspected a trap, seeing how thin the ribbon was. He agreed only if one of the gods would place their hand in his mouth as a pledge of honest intentions. No one wanted to sacrifice their hand. Everyone knew that if Fenrir could not break free, he would bite it off. Then Tyr stepped forward and placed his right hand in the wolf's mouth. Gleipnir was put on Fenrir, and the more he struggled, the tighter the ribbon became. Realizing they had deceived him, Fenrir closed his jaws, biting off Tyr's hand at the wrist. The gods chained the wolf to a rock deep underground, inserting a sword between his jaws so he could not bite. The saliva flowing from Fenrir's mouth formed the river Von, expectation. There he would lie until Ragnarök, when he would break his bonds and devour Odin himself. The second monstrous offspring of Loki was the world serpent, Jormungandr. When the gods found him as a cub, Odin snatched the serpent and threw him into the ocean surrounding Midgard. There, Jormungandr grew so large that he coiled around the whole world and bit his own tail. He lay on the bottom of the ocean, and sailors feared him more than any storm. When the serpent moved, whirlpools formed that swallowed ships. His meeting with Thor during the fishing trip with the giant Hymir was one of the most dramatic moments in mythology. Thor nearly pulled the serpent to the surface and killed him, but the giant cut the line. On the day of Ragnarok, Jormungandr will emerge from the sea, poisoning the land and sky with his venom. He will battle Thor, and each will kill the other. Thor will split the serpent's head with Mjolnir, but he himself will fall dead, poisoned, after taking only 9 steps. The third offspring was Hel, a maiden half alive, half dead. Her face and body were beautiful on one side and decomposing, black, and terrible on the other. Odin sent her to the netherworld, giving her authority over the 9 realms of the dead. There, Hel ruled in her hall, Elgidnir times, dampened with sleet. Her table was called hunger, her knife famine, her bed sickbed, and her curtains gleaming misery. Her servants were slow to the extreme. In her domains ended up all those who died of illness, old age, or accidents. This was not a hell in the Christian sense, but existence there was joyless. Gray shadows wandered in cold and mist. Hel will rule the kingdom of the dead until Ragnarök, when she will lead her army of ghosts against the gods in the final battle. Loki was the cause of many crises in Asgard. One of the most serious occurred when the gods decided to reinforce the walls of Asgard after the war with the Vanir. An unknown master builder came to them and offered to rebuild the fortifications in 3 seasons. The price he set was incredible. The goddess Freyja as a wife, as well as the sun and the moon. The gods wanted to refuse, but Loki proposed a cunning plan. They agreed to the conditions, but with an amendment. The work must be finished in 1 winter without help from other humans. If not a single stone was in place by the first day of summer, the builder would receive nothing. The Aesir thought it impossible. The builder agreed but asked for permission to use his horse, Svadilfari. The gods, on Loki's advice, agreed. Work proceeded at an incredible speed. The horse Svadilfari carried huge boulders at night, which the builder placed with magical dexterity. To the gods' horror, 3 days before winter ended, the wall was almost ready. The Aesir realized that the builder would fulfill the conditions and they would lose Freyja, the sun, and the moon, and the world would plunge into darkness and cold. The gods gathered for a council and blamed Loki. It was he who persuaded them to accept the conditions. They threatened to kill him if he did not find a way out. Loki promised to fix the situation. On the last night before the deadline, when the builder had sent Svadilfari for the final batch of stones, a beautiful mare ran out of the forest and whinnied. It was Loki, who had taken female form. The stallion raced after the mare, and the builder could not bring the final stones. The work remained unfinished. The enraged builder threw off his mask. He turned out to be a stone giant from Jotunheim. In a fury, he tried to destroy everything he had built. Then the gods summoned Thor, who with 1 blow of Mjolnir split the giant's head into small fragments and sent him to Niflheim. Loki returned several months later, bringing with him an 8-legged foal Sleipnir, whom he had birthed by Svadilfari. This horse Loki gifted to Odin, and Sleipnir became the best steed in all worlds. Thus, the gods received fortress walls and a miraculous horse without paying anything. But this story showed the dangerous nature of Loki. His plans always balanced on the brink of catastrophe, and only chance or a new trick saved the situation. Another story demonstrated how Loki created problems out of simple curiosity or malicious intent. Once, he sneaked into Thor's quarters and cut off all the golden hair of Sif, the Thunderer's wife, while she slept. When Sif woke up bald and wept, Thor was so enraged that he nearly killed Loki. The trickster swore to fix the damage and set off to the dwarves, the sons of Ivaldi. These skilled smiths created hair out of real gold that grew like living hair. Furthermore, they made the spear Gungnir for Odin and the ship Skidbladnir for Freyr. Loki decided he could get even more treasures and made a wager with other dwarves, the brothers Sindri and Brokkr. He wagered his head that they could not create things better than the sons of Ivaldi. Sindri began the forging, ordering his brother Brokkr to work the bellows and not stop for a single moment. Loki turned into a fly and began biting Brokkr, trying to disrupt the work. First, Sindri placed a pigskin in the hearth, and from it emerged the golden boar Gullinbursti. Loki bit Brokkr on the hand, but he continued to work the bellows. Then Sindri placed gold in the fire, and out came the ring Draupnir, the source of infinite wealth. The fly bit Brokkr on the neck, but he did not stop. Finally, Sindri placed iron to forge a hammer. The fly bit Brokkr's eyelid, and blood poured into his eyes. For a moment, the dwarf stopped the bellows to brush away the fly. That moment was enough for the hammer's handle to turn out shorter than planned. But the hammer, Mjolnir itself, was perfect. It never missed its mark, and always returned to Thor's hand. The dwarves brought their creations to Asgard, and the gods had to judge whose items were better. Odin received Gungnir and Draupnir. Freyja received Skidbladnir and Gullinbursti. Thor received the golden hair for Sif and Mjolnir. The gods unanimously declared that Thor's hammer was the greatest of the treasures, for it would be the main defense against giants. Loki lost the wager, and Brokkr demanded his head. Loki agreed to give his head but not his neck. The wager did not include the neck. While the dwarves argued, Loki asked Thor to protect him, and Thor intervened. In the end, Brokkr did not get Loki's head, but in retaliation, he sewed Loki's lips shut with a leather strap, so he could not chatter and deceive. Loki tore the strap out, leaving scars on his lips, but he received an important lesson which, however, taught him nothing. The most dramatic episode involving Loki was the kidnapping of Idun and her apples of youth. Once, Odin, Loki, and Honir were traveling through the mountains and decided to cook a bull for dinner, but the meat would not roast, no matter how much they stoked the fire. On a tree above them sat a huge eagle and mocked their failure. It was the giant Thjazi in the guise of a bird. He offered to help cook the meat in exchange for his share. The gods agreed, and the meat roasted instantly, but Thjazi took almost the whole carcass for himself. An enraged Loki grabbed a stick and struck the eagle. Thjazi took off, and the stick stuck to his body, and the other end stuck to Loki's hands. The giant dragged him over the ground, stones, and trees until Loki begged for mercy. Thjazi agreed to release him only on the condition that Loki would lure Idun with the apples of youth out of Asgard. Loki fulfilled the promise. He told Idun about miraculous apples that grew in a forest not far from Asgard, and persuaded her to take her apples for comparison. As soon as Idun went beyond the divine fortress, Thjazi grabbed her along with her box of apples and carried her off to his home in Thrymheim, high in the mountains. Without the apples of youth, the gods began to age. Their hair turned gray, their skin wrinkled, and their strength left them. Asgard plunged into despair. The gods gathered for a council and remembered that Idun was last seen in the company of Loki. They captured him, and under threat of torture and death, forced him to confess. The gods ordered Loki to return Idun, or else he would die the most painful death. Loki asked Freyja for her falcon plumage and flew to Thrymheim. Thjazi was at sea at that moment, fishing. Loki turned Idun into a nut, took her in his claws, and flew back to Asgard. Thjazi, having returned, discovered the loss, assumed the shape of an eagle, and raced in pursuit. His enormous wings carried him faster than the falcon could fly, and he was quickly catching up to Loki. The gods saw the falcon flying toward Asgard, and behind it, a giant eagle. They quickly piled shavings at the wall of Asgard. When Loki flew over the wall, the gods set fire to the shavings. The flame shot upward, scorching Thjazi's wings. The giant fell inside Asgard, where the gods finished him off. Idun was saved, and the gods regained their youth. But Thjazi had a daughter, Skadi, who came to Asgard to demand compensation for the death of her father. This began the episode with her marriage to Njord, and her condition that the gods must make her laugh, which Loki did with an obscene trick involving a goat. Despite all his pranks, Loki long remained part of the divine community. He participated in councils, feasts, and the gods' campaigns. His wit and resourcefulness were often useful, but over time his actions became more evil and destructive. The turning point was the death of Baldur, the most beloved of the gods, the son of Odin and Frigg. This crime was so terrible that even Odin could no longer protect his blood brother. After the murder of Baldur, Loki fled Asgard and hid in the mountains. He built a house with 4 doors to see in all 4 directions, fearing the gods' revenge. During the day, he transformed into a salmon and hid in the Franangr waterfall. Once, sitting by the fire, Loki wondered how the gods might catch him and wove the first fishing net out of flax, but then saw the gods approaching, threw the net into the fire, turned into a salmon, and jumped into the waterfall. The gods entered the house and found the ash of the net. The wise Kvasir realized what it was, and the gods wove a similar net. They dragged it through the river, but Loki jumped over it. Then the gods weighted the net with stones. Loki tried to hide between 2 stones on the bottom, but he was spotted. Finally, He tried to jump the net again, and Thor, who was standing in the middle of the river, caught him by the hand. The salmon slipped, but Thor squeezed the tail with all his might. Ever since, the salmon's tail tapers to the end. Loki was captured. The gods brought him to a cave where they set up 3 stone slabs. They took Loki's sons by Sigyn, Nari, and Narvi. They turned Narvi into a wolf, who tore his brother Nari apart. With the entrails of the murdered son, the gods bound Loki, tying him to the 3 stones, one under his shoulders, the second under his waist, the third under his knees. The entrails turned into iron chains. Skadi, the giantess, still hating the gods for the death of her father Thjazi, brought a venomous snake and fastened it above Loki's head. The venom dripped onto his face, causing unbearable pain. Only the faithful Sigyn remained with her husband. She sat beside him holding a basin that caught the drops of poison. But when the basin was full, Sigyn would walk away to empty it, and the venom fell on Loki's face. He would convulse from the pain so violently that the earth would shake. Thus the Norse explained earthquakes. Loki would lie in shackles until Ragnarok, when all bonds would be broken. Then he would lead an army of the dead and giants against the gods, become the helmsman on the ship of the dead, Naglfar, and perish in battle together with the entire old world. His story is a story of betrayal, but also of the inevitability of chaos, which exists even in the ordered world of the gods. Balder was the embodiment of everything bright and beautiful in the world of the gods. The son of Odin and Frigg, he surpassed all the Aesir in beauty. He radiated light like the sun. His blonde hair shone. His skin was whiter than milk, and everything about his appearance spoke of purity and nobility. Balder was wise, just, and eloquent. All the gods loved him, and even the flowers bowed before him. He lived in Asgard in the hall Breidablik, Broadgleam, where nothing impure could exist. His wife was named Nanna. She was the daughter of the god Nep. From her, Balder had a son, Forseti, who became the god of fairness and justice. Forseti lived in a gold and silver hall, Glitnir, where he resolved the disputes of gods and humans, and everyone recognized his judgments as fair. But Balder himself was doomed to a tragic fate that would become the beginning of the end for the world of the gods. It all began with bad dreams. Balder started having nightmares about his own death. He saw darkness, cold, and his own lifeless body. These dreams repeated night after night, becoming ever more terrible. The gods became worried. Dreams for the Norse were not just a play of the mind, but messages of fate, predictions of the future. Frigg, Balder's mother, could not accept the thought of her beloved son's death. She decided to act. The goddess set off on a journey through all 9 worlds and took an oath from all beings and objects that they would not cause harm to Balder. Fire and water, iron and all metals, stones and earth, trees and plants, illnesses and poisons, beasts and birds all swore not to harm the bright god. Frigg traveled the whole world, and everyone gave an oath. She missed only one tiny plant, thinking it too young and insignificant. It was the mistletoe, a parasite growing on trees. When Frigg returned to Asgard, the gods decided to test whether Balder had truly become invulnerable. They gathered at the Thing Times assembly, and began throwing everything at him. Rocks bounced off without leaving a trace. Arrows turned in flight. Swords could not cut his skin. Balder stood and laughed, and the gods rejoiced, turning the tests into a game. It became a diversion at feasts. Everyone strove to invent a new way to attack Balder, and every time, nothing happened. It seemed the beginning of a new era, where the chief of the gods had become invulnerable. But in the corner of the hall stood Loki, and his heart filled with envy and malice. He could not bear the happiness of others, especially such universal admiration for Balder. Envy turned into a desire to destroy this idol. Loki turned into an old woman, and came to Frigg in her hall, Fenrir. He asked, "Why are the gods having so much fun?" And Frigg told him about the oaths. Pretending to be surprised, the old woman asked, "Did absolutely everything give an oath?" Frigg replied, "Everything, except for one little sprig of mistletoe growing west of Valhalla. It is too young to give an oath." Having received this information, Loki immediately set off to the mistletoe. He plucked a branch, sharpened it, and returned to the thing, where the gods continued to amuse themselves with Balder. To the side stood Hod, the blind brother of Balder, son of Odin and Frigg. He did not participate in the general merriment because he could not see the target. Loki approached him and offered to help. He placed the spear of mistletoe in Hod's hand and guided his arm. Hod threw the spear, and it pierced Balder through. The bright god fell dead, and at that moment, the whole world plunged into darkness. The sun dimmed, and joy left Asgard. The gods stood frozen in horror, not believing what had happened. This was the greatest tragedy that had ever befallen the Aesir. They knew Balder's death meant the beginning of Ragnarök, the inevitable end of the world. The prophecy of the vulva had begun to come true. Frigg wept over her son's body, and Odin, seeing the depth of the catastrophe with his single eye, understood that the bonds of fate were tightening. No one dared to avenge Hod right on the sacred ground of the thing, but everyone knew who the true culprit was. Loki quietly disappeared from the assembly, understanding that he had committed an unforgivable crime. Frigg turned to the gods with a plea. Someone must go to Helheim and try to return Balder. She promised her love and favor to anyone who would risk this journey. Hermod the Bold, another son of Odin, volunteered. He mounted Sleipnir and rode for 9 days along the dark roads leading to the kingdom of the dead. He passed through deep valleys where there was no light. He crossed the river Gjöll via a golden bridge guarded by the maiden Modgud. Finally, he reached the gates of Helheim, but they were locked. Sleipnir took a run and jumped over the gate in one leap. No one living could enter the kingdom of Hel by the usual path. Hermod found Balder sitting on a high throne in the hall of Hel. The dead god was pale but recognized his brother and greeted him with sadness. Hermod appealed to Hel herself with a request to release Balder. The goddess of the dead, half beautiful and half decomposing, listened to him and replied, "If it is true that Balder was loved by everyone in the world, I will release him. Let all living and dead things and beings mourn him. If even one thing refuses to cry, Balder will remain here." Hermod returned to Asgard with this condition, and the gods sent messengers to all the worlds. People wept for Balder. The gods sobbed. Beasts and birds, trees and stones, metals and earth, all living and inanimate things mourned the bright god. Even plants shed drops of dew like tears. It seemed the condition would be met. But the messengers found a giantess in a cave named Thok, Gratitude. They asked her to weep for Balder. Thok refused. "With dry eyes, I will pay for the death of Balder. Neither living nor dead has this son brought me any benefit. Let Hel keep what she has." With these words, the giantess vanished into the depths of the cave. The gods realized it was Loki, who had taken the guise of Thok, who had displayed his malice one last time. Because of the refusal of one being, Balder remained in the kingdom of the dead. His body was burned on the funeral ship Ringhorni, the largest ship in the world. The funeral was majestic. Odin placed the ring Draupnir on the funeral pyre. Nanna, Balder's wife, could not bear the grief. Her heart broke with sorrow, and her body was laid next to her husband's. Balder's horse was also led onto the ship and killed so it would accompany its master in the afterlife. Thor blessed the pyre with Mjolnir, and the ship, engulfed in flames, was launched into the sea. All of Asgard mourned the loss. The gods could not avenge Hod immediately for Balder's death. He had acted unintentionally, deceived by Loki, and the murder occurred in a sacred place where blood feuds were forbidden, but Hod's fate was predetermined. Odin had a liaison with the princess Rind in Midgard, and she bore a son, Vali. This god grew to manhood in a single day and, without washing his hands or combing his hair, took revenge for Balder by killing Hod. Thus, the prophecy was fulfilled, but the main revenge awaited Loki. After he was tracked down and captured in the guise of a salmon, the gods chained him in a cave, where he would suffer until the end of time. Balder's death became the point of no return. After it, events moved irrevocably toward Ragnarok. The world could no longer be saved. Order began to collapse, and the gods knew that the final battle awaited them ahead. Balder, however, did not die forever. The prophecy of Ragnarök and the world after it stated that after the destruction of the old world and the birth of a new one, Balder would return from Hel along with Hod. The two brothers, one who killed the other by Loki's malicious intent, would reconcile and rule the new world together with Thor's sons, Magni and Modi, and the few surviving gods. Balder symbolized the hope for rebirth, that after the darkness and destruction, a new, better world would come. His death was a necessary sacrifice, through which the old, imperfect order had to perish, so that something new could be born. This idea of cyclical time, death, and rebirth was central to Norse cosmology, distinguishing it from the linear time of the Christian tradition. In addition to the main deities, Asgard was inhabited by many other gods. each with their own functions and stories. Tyr was one of the most ancient gods of war, older than Odin in a historical sense. His name is related to the Indo-European sky god Daus, Zeus, Jupiter. In the early period, Tyr was possibly the chief god of the northern Germanic peoples, but he was gradually eclipsed by Odin. Tyr remained a god of war, but of a special kind. He was the patron of just war, duels, oaths, and justice. He was invoked before judicial duels. The most sacred oaths were sworn in his name. Tyr was one-handed. He lost his right hand when he helped the gods bind the wolf Fenrir. This sacrifice for the common good made Tyr a symbol of duty and self-sacrifice. At Ragnarök, Tyr will perish in battle with the dog Garm, the guardian of the gates of hell, killing it but himself receiving mortal wounds. Heimdall was the guardian of the gods, watching over the rainbow bridge Bifrost, which connected Asgard and Midgard. He was called the White Aesir. He was light-skinned and light-haired. Heimdall possessed the keenest vision and hearing. He could see for hundreds of miles day and night, and he could hear the grass growing on the earth and the wool on sheep. He never slept, or slept less than a bird, according to different versions. Heimdall had the horn times, Gjallar horn times, a loud horn that he would blow at the start of Ragnarök, calling the gods to the final battle. The sound of this horn would be heard in all 9 worlds. Heimdall's origin was mysterious. He was called the son of 9 mothers, possibly the 9 daughters of the sea giant Aegir, which made his birth unique. Heimdall traveled through Midgard under the name Rig, visiting the homes of humans and becoming the progenitor of 3 social classes: slaves, free peasants, and nobility. Bragi was the god of poetry and eloquence. His name meant poet or prince. Bragi was the husband of Idun, the keeper of the apples of youth. Runes were inscribed on his tongue, and his speech enchanted all listeners. Skalds invoked Bragi, asking for inspiration for their songs. At feasts in Valhalla, Bragi greeted fallen warriors when they first arrived at Odin's hall. His role was important, for poetry in Scandinavian society was not just entertainment. It preserved history, transmitted knowledge, glorified deeds, and ensured the immortality of fame. A good song by a skald could make a warrior immortal in the memory of descendants, which was more important than physical life for a Viking. A bad song could disgrace a family forever. Therefore, the skill of Bragi was valued very highly, and he himself occupied a place of honor among the Aesir. Forseti, the son of Balder and Nanna, was the god of justice and reconciliation. He lived in Glitnir, a hall with golden pillars and a silver roof that shone brighter than the sun. Gods and humans came there with irresolvable disputes, and Forseti would listen to both sides. His judgments were so fair and wise that everyone left reconciled, recognizing the correctness of the decision. In Scandinavian society, where blood feuds could destroy entire clans, the role of a mediator was critically important. Forseti embodied the ideal of such a judge: impartial, wise, and capable of finding a solution that satisfied warring parties. His cult was especially strong on the Frisian Islands, where traditions about his intervention in disputes between tribes survived. Vidar was the god of silence and revenge. He almost never spoke, was the strongest after Thor, and wore thick shoes. These shoes played a key role in his fate. Vidar was the son of Odin and the giantess Grid. At Ragnarök, when Fenrir swallows Odin, Vidar will avenge his father. He will step with his boot on the wolf's lower jaw, grab the upper jaw with his hands, and tear Fenrir's maw apart, killing the monster. Vidar's shoe was magical. Throughout the history of the world, people cutting leather for shoes would throw away the scraps at the toe and heel, and these scraps were collected to form Vidar's shoe. Thus, people, without knowing it, helped create the weapon that would kill the greatest monster. After Ragnarök, Vidar would be one of the few gods who survived the catastrophe and would rule the new world together with Vali, Magni, Modi, and the resurrected Balder. Vali was the god of revenge, born specifically to avenge Balder. His mother, Rindr, was a mortal princess whom Odin seduced by taking various forms. Vali grew to adulthood in a single day and, without washing his hands or combing his hair, went and killed Hod. This story showed that revenge was a sacred duty in Scandinavian culture, and even the gods were not free from this obligation. Vali will also survive Ragnarök and rule the new world. His function was narrow but important. He embodied the inevitability of retribution, the idea that murder, even accidental, must be avenged. This concept maintained a fragile balance in a society where there was no centralized power capable of punishing criminals. The fear of vengeance by the victim's kin served as the main deterrent. Ol was the god of hunting, skiing, archery, and duels. His name meant glory or radiance. Ol was the son of Sif from her first marriage, the stepson of Thor. He lived in times Yggdrasil times, Yew-dale, the dale of yew trees from which the best bows were made. Ol was such a skilled archer that no one could compare with him. He was also the greatest skier among the gods. In the northern regions of Scandinavia, where snow lay most of the year, the ability to ski was vital for hunting and movement. Ol patronized hunters and those who challenged opponents to a duel. Oaths were sworn in his name before judicial duels. There were legends that Ol once drove Odin out of Asgard and ruled for 10 years, but this story survived only in fragments, and its details are unclear. Var was the goddess of oaths and agreements. She heard all the promises that people made to each other, especially marriage oaths. Her name meant vow or oath. Var punished those who broke their promises. In a society where written contracts were almost non-existent, the spoken word, backed by an oath, was the basis of all agreements. To break an oath meant not just to deceive a person but to offend the goddess, which brought a curse upon the oathbreaker and his entire family. An oathbreaker became an outlaw, a times knighting, times a man of dishonor whom anyone could kill with impunity. Var ensured the sanctity of the oath, making it not just words but a bond that could not be broken without terrible consequences. Snotra was the goddess of wisdom, modesty, and courtesy. Her name came from the word times, Snoter times, wise, clever. Snotra taught people restraint in speech, the ability to behave with dignity, and the capacity to understand other people. In a society of warriors, where pride and honor meant everything, the ability to avoid unnecessary conflict, to save face without insulting an opponent, was critically important. It was this wisdom that Snotra taught. She embodied the ideal of a person who is strong but not boastful, brave but not reckless, respected but not arrogant. These qualities were valued no less than martial prowess, for society could not exist if every dispute was solved by the sword. Sjofn was the goddess who guarded doors and kept those who shouldn't enter out of the house. She was invoked to protect the dwelling from enemies, thieves, and evil spirits. In Scandinavian culture, the home was a sacred space where special rules of hospitality and protection applied. The threshold was the border between the external, dangerous world and the internal, safe space of the family. Sjofn guarded this border. Interestingly, even enemies who crossed the threshold and were accepted as guests became inviolable as long as they remained in the house. Laws of hospitality were sacred, and Sjofn watched over their observance. Violation of these laws, the murder of a guest or host during hospitality, was considered one of the most terrible crimes. Na was the goddess messenger of Frigg. She flew on the horse times, Hofarpnir times, hoof-thrower, who could gallop through the sky and over the sea. Gna carried Frigg's errands to all worlds, delivered messages, and learned news. Her role was important in divine diplomacy when it was necessary to quickly deliver news or negotiate something. In a society where news traveled only by companions and messengers, fast communication had enormous value. Na could fly around all 9 worlds in a day and return, which made her indispensable for Frigg in managing the gods' affairs and observing what was happening in the human world. The 9 worlds, connected by Yggdrasil, were inhabited not only by gods and humans. Many other beings lived there, each with its own nature and role in the cosmic order. Giants and Jotuns were the oldest of intelligent beings, older than the gods. They embodied the primordial forces of chaos, the uncontrollable elements of nature. The Jotuns were enormous, strong, and often hostile to the gods. They lived in Jotunheim, a rocky, cold land of mountains and glaciers. Not all giants were evil. Some possessed wisdom. Others were neutral toward the gods. Odin himself learned from the wise giant Mimir. Many gods took Jotun giantesses as wives. Odin married Jord. Freyr married Gerd. Njord married Skadi. These marriages symbolized the alliance of ordered forces of civilization with the wild forces of nature, which was necessary to maintain the balance of the universe. There were different types of giants. The times Hrimthur's times were frost giants born from Ymir, living among the ice of Niflheim. Bergrisi times, mountain giants, inhabited caves and mountain peaks. The Jotuns of the sea ruled ocean storms and waves. The most powerful of the sea giants was Aegir, who lived in an underwater hall. He did not war with the gods. On the contrary, he hosted magnificent feasts for them. His wife Ran caught the drowned in her net and took them to her underwater world. Sailors who drowned ended up with Ran and could continue to feast in her halls if they had been brave in life. Aegir and Ran had 9 daughters, the waves of the ocean, each with her own name and character. These maidens were possibly the 9 mothers who bore Heimdall, although the mythological tradition gives no unambiguous answer. The fire giants, the Muspelli, lived in Muspelheim, the world of eternal flame in the south of the cosmos. Their leader, Surtur the Black, was the oldest of them, existing even before the creation of the world. Surtur sat on the border of Muspelheim with a flaming sword, guarding his domain. At Ragnarök, it is Surtur who will lead the army of fire giants to the Bifrost Bridge. The bridge will crumble under the weight of their army, but the Muspelli will break into Asgard. In the finale of the battle, Surtur will swing his sword, and flames will engulf all worlds. The earth will burn, the sky will fall, the seas will boil, and the old world will perish in fire. Only after this fire will a new, green and fertile land rise from the sea, and a new cycle of existence will begin. Surtur was not a villain but an executor of cosmic law, a destroyer whose function consisted in cleansing the world with fire for its subsequent rebirth. Dwarves, Dvergr, lived underground in Svartalfheim. They were the most skilled blacksmiths and masters, having created all the greatest treasures of the gods. The dwarves were born as worms in the flesh of the dead Ymir, but the gods gave them reason and form. They were short, stocky, and possessed immense strength. Sunlight turned the dwarves into stone, so they lived in underground halls, coming out only at night. The dwarves were greedy for gold and precious stones, which they extracted in the depths of the earth. They traded with gods and humans, but always demanded a high price for their products. Some of them were wise and fair, like the brothers Sindri and Brokkr. Others were evil and treacherous, like Fjalar and Galar, who killed Kvasir for his blood. The names of many dwarves have been preserved in sources: Dvalin, Alvises, Durin, Motsognir, Regin, and Vari. Andvari was a dwarf who possessed untold wealth in an underground river. He could turn into a fish and swim, guarding his treasures. Once, the gods Odin, Honir, and Loki were traveling through Midgard and stopped by a waterfall where an otter was eating a salmon. Loki killed the otter with a stone, and they took its pelt with them. But the otter turned out to be the son of a man named Hreidmar, who could transform into animals. Hreidmar and his remaining sons, Fafnir and Regin, captured the gods and demanded restitution. Fill the otter's skin with gold and cover it on the outside so that not a single hair was visible. Loki went to Andvari, caught him in a net, and forced him to give up all his gold. The dwarf gave up the hoard but tried to hide one small ring. Loki took it, too. Then Andvari cursed the ring. It would bring death to every owner. The gods filled the otter's skin with gold, but one hair remained visible. They had to place the cursed ring of Andvari on top. Hreidmar accepted the restitution and released the gods, but the curse immediately began to work. Fafnir killed his father to seize the gold, turned into a dragon, and lay down to guard the hoard on Gnita Heath. Regin set off to Midgard, where he became a blacksmith and raised the hero Sigurd, urging him to kill Fafnir. Sigurd defeated the dragon, but the curse continued to act, bringing death to everyone who owned the ring. This story, set forth in the times Volsunga Saga times and Eddic poems, showed the dangers of greed and the power of curses, a lesson that was repeated many times in Scandinavian literature. The Alfar, elves, inhabited Alfheim, a world of light and beauty. They were close to the gods, beautiful in appearance, and linked to the sun, light, and fertility. The elves did not play a big role in the surviving myths, but they were honored on a par with the gods. There existed a cult of the Alfar, to whom sacrifices were offered along with the Aesir and Vanir. One festival, the Times Alphablot, was held in autumn and was closed to outsiders. Only family members could participate. At this festival, ancestors and the Alfar were honored, asking for their blessing for the winter. The Alfar were often identified with the spirits of ancestors who, after death, went into hills and mounds, becoming protectors of their descendants. Freyr was closely linked to the elves. He was called the Lord of Alfheim, and sacrifices were offered to him and the elves together, especially to ensure fertility. The Dark Elves, Svartalfar, were in many ways similar to the dwarves. Perhaps these were different names for the same beings. They lived underground, avoided sunlight, and were skilled craftsmen. The border between Svartalfar and dwarves in the sources is blurred. Sometimes the same characters are called by different names. In any case, they represented the underground aspect of the universe, the connection to the earth, ores, and the riches of the bowels of the earth. They were necessary for cosmic balance, for without their mastery, the gods could not have obtained their magical artifacts, and humans good weapons and tools. Relations with them required caution and respect. The dwarves remembered insults and could take revenge, but by bargaining with them properly, one could obtain priceless gifts. Valkyries were daughters of Odin or noble earthly kings, elevated by the All-Father to the status of semi-goddesses. Their name meant choosers of the slain. The Valkyries donned armor, took spears and shields, and flew over battlefields. They chose the bravest and fallen warriors and carried their souls to Valhalla. The Valkyries were also handmaidens in Odin's hall, offering the warriors horns of mead and serving at the Einherjar's feasts. Each Valkyrie had her own name, reflecting her function or character: Gondul, wand wielder; Skogul, raging; Hildur, battle; Thrud, strength; Luck, noise of battle; Hefjutua, host feta; Geirskogul, spear shaker. Some Valkyries appeared in heroic sagas as lovers of mortal heroes. Brynhild, the greatest of the Valkyries, disobeyed Odin by granting victory to the wrong warrior. In punishment, the All-Father pierced her with a magical sleep thorn and left her to sleep in a ring of fire, from which she could only be saved by a hero who knew no fear. Sigurd, the slayer of Fafnir, fought his way through the flames and awakened the Valkyrie, but their love ended in tragedy. The Norns were more powerful than the Valkyries and even the gods. The three great Norns, Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld, sat at the well of Urd under the roots of Yggdrasil. Their names meant fate, becoming, and duty, or, in another interpretation, past, present, and future. The Norns spun the threads of life for all beings: gods, giants, Alfar, and humans. When a being was born, the Norns determined the length and pattern of its life thread. No one could change what the Norns had inscribed. Even Odin could not avoid his fate of being swallowed by Fenrir. The Norns drew water from the well of Urd every day, and watered the roots of Yggdrasil so that the world tree would not dry up. Besides the three great Norns, there existed many lesser Norns, good and evil, who determined the fates of individual people. When a child was born, the Norns would come to his cradle and predict his future. Dragons and snakes inhabited various worlds. The greatest of them was Nidhogg, the dragon gnawing from below, who lived in Niflheim at the well Hvergelmir. He constantly gnawed at the roots of Yggdrasil, trying to destroy the world tree. Together with him, a multitude of snakes tormented the roots. Between Nidhogg and the eagle sitting on the top of Yggdrasil, there existed an ancient enmity. The squirrel Ratatoskr ran up and down the trunk, carrying insults from one to the other, maintaining their quarrel. This constant struggle between the dragon below and the eagle above symbolized the cosmic confrontation of chthonic and heavenly forces. Besides Nidhogg, there existed other dragons. Fafnir, transformed by a curse from a man into a dragon, guarded Anvari's gold on Gnita, Heath, until he was killed by Sigurd. Jormungandr, the world serpent, lay in the ocean, and his stirrings caused storms and earthquakes. Nature spirits, the Times Landvættir, inhabited Midgard everywhere. Each locality had its own spirits: protectors of mountains, forests, reservoirs, individual stones, and trees. The Landvættir protected their territory from the intrusion of hostile forces but demanded respect from humans. When a Viking ship approached its home shores, the figureheads in the form of dragon heads were removed so as not to scare the spirits of the land. The first settlers in Iceland threw high seat pillars overboard, and where they were washed ashore, they founded their homestead. It was believed that the spirits of the land indicated the best place. The Landvættir were given small offerings. Food and drink were left near stones and in sacred groves. These spirits were neither good nor evil. They protected their domains and favored those who treated nature with due respect. Disir times were female guardian spirits linked to specific clans and families. They protected their descendants, warned of danger through dreams and omens, and helped in difficult times. The Disir were linked to the Norns and Valkyries but acted on a more personal level. Each family had its own Disir, who were honored at a special festival, the Times Disseblot, celebrated in winter. Women of the clan gathered together and offered sacrifices to the Disir, asking for protection for all members of the family. These spirits could appear as women in white clothes, sometimes foretelling death. If a person saw the Disir of their clan, it could mean that their time was near. However, the Disir could also actively intervene, saving their charges from death if they deserved it. Freyja times was a personal guardian spirit of every person, often taking the form of an animal. This animal corresponded to the person's character. A brave warrior could have a Freyja in the form of a bear or wolf, a cunning merchant, a fox, a wise woman, an owl. The Freyja appeared in dreams, warning of impending events. Sometimes people saw the Freyja of their enemy before a battle, and could judge the strength of the opponent by its form. A female Freyja could take the form of a beautiful woman and come to a person in a dream, offering advice. When a person died, their Freyja passed to their descendants, usually to one of the children or grandchildren who most resembled the deceased in character. Thus, the spirits of ancestors continued to protect the clan from generation to generation, linking the living and the dead with invisible bonds. Huldufolk times, hidden people, made up a parallel humanity living in hills, rocks, and underground. They were invisible to the ordinary eye, but sometimes revealed themselves to humans. The Huldufolk lived like people. They had families, engaged in farming, and grazed livestock. Their cattle were invisible but could mix with ordinary herds. Relations with the hidden people required caution. They could help people and bestow wealth, but they also took revenge for insults. Building a house on the site of a Huldufolk dwelling meant bringing misfortune upon oneself. Many stones and hills were considered dwellings of the hidden people and were left untouched. In Iceland, even in the 20th century, roads were laid to bypass elfin stones, and some still believe in the Huldufolk today, supporting one of the most persistent traditions of the ancient Scandinavian faith. Mara times were evil spirits that sent nightmares. The word nightmare comes from the Scandinavian times Mara times a night demon. The Mara appeared to a sleeping person, sat on their chest, and caused a sensation of suffocation and terrifying visions. It was believed that certain people, especially women who possessed magical abilities, could turn into Maras and send nightmares to enemies. There existed spells and amulets for protection against Maras. Scissors in the shape of a cross were hung over the bed, or a knife was placed under the pillow. A special magical sign called Times Mara Stafir Times was drawn over the bedroom door. The Maras were a manifestation of the fear of the uncontrollable forces of the night when a person was most vulnerable. In the Viking Age, it was believed that enemies could harm each other not only physically but also magically, through curses and the sending of evil spirits. Draugr times. Wights were animated corpses that inhabited burial mounds. Unlike bodiless ghosts, a Draugr had a physical body endowed with supernatural strength. It guarded the treasures with which it was buried and attacked the living who dared to disturb its mound. Draugr possessed the ability to change size, becoming enormous, could pass through the earth, and send madness and disease. Some Draugr rose from graves and pursued their enemies or offenders. Killing a Draugr was extremely difficult. It required cutting off its head, burning the body, and scattering the ashes or drowning them in the sea. Many sagas told of heroes battling Draugr in mounds. These stories reflected the real tradition of grave robbing in search of treasure, which was a dangerous but profitable occupation. Animals played an important role in Scandinavian cosmology. An unnamed eagle sat on the summit of Yggdrasil. Between its eyes sat the hawk Vedrfolnir. Shaken by the storm, the stags Dine, Dvalin, Duneyr, and Durethro grazed on the leaves of Yggdrasil. The goat Heidrun stood on the roof of Valhalla, grazing on the leaves of the world tree, and from her udder flowed mead, which the Einherjar drank. The stag Eikthirnir, oak thorn, also ate the foliage of Yggdrasil, and from its antlers dripped water that nourished the rivers. The boar Seirimnir served as food for the warriors of Valhalla every day. It was resurrected whole, every night. The rooster Golinkambi, golden comb, awakened the Einherjar every morning, and at Ragnarök, his crowing would herald the start of the final battle. Another rooster, unnamed, would crow in hell, raising the dead from their graves. Wolves occupied a special place in mythology. Fenrir, Geri, and Freki, Skoll, and Hati, all of them embodied destructive power. However, the wolf was also the sacred animal of Odin, a symbol of martial valor. Berserkers, elite warriors, wore wolf pelts, and called themselves Times Ulfhednar times, wolf-headed. Ravens Hugin and Munin flew through the worlds, gathering information for Odin. The raven was a bird of battle, a harbinger of death. On battlefields, flocks of ravens gathered to feast on the corpses of the fallen. A battle was sometimes called the Raven's Feast, but ravens also symbolized wisdom, memory, and the ability to see what is hidden. Ragnarok, fate of the gods or twilight of the gods, was the inevitable end of the old world. The prophecy about it was given to Odin by a Volva, whom he summoned from the grave using necromancy. The dead seeress told the Allfather about all the events that would lead to the destruction of the gods and worlds. Odin knew he could not change fate, but he prepared to meet it with dignity. Ragnarok was not a sudden catastrophe. It was preceded by signs, a period of the world's deterioration, called times Fimbulvetter times, the Great Winter. This winter lasted 3 years without a summer between them. Snow fell from all sides of the world. The winds were fierce. The sun gave no warmth. People died of hunger and cold. Society disintegrated. Brother rose against brother. Sons killed fathers for a piece of bread. Sacred bonds of kinship were torn. Oaths were violated, and no one kept their promises. Moral decay preceded physical destruction. A time of axes, a time of swords, a time of wolves, is how the seeress described the era before the end. People lost their humanity, becoming beastly from despair and fear. In this time, the wolves, Skoll and Hati, finally caught the sun and moon, swallowing them. The world plunged into darkness. Stars fell from the firmament. The earth shook from continuous earthquakes. All chains and bonds were broken. Fenrir freed himself from his shackles underground. His maw gaped so wide that his upper jaw touched the sky and the lower touched the earth. His eyes and nostrils flared with fire. Jormungandr crawled from the ocean onto land, poisoning the air and earth with his venom. The sea rose in giant waves, flooding the shores. From Niflheim sailed the ship times Naglfar, made of the nails of the dead, because the Vikings ensured the nails of the deceased were trimmed, as every untrimmed nail brought the completion of the ship closer. Naglfar was enormous. It carried the entire host of the dead. The helmsman of this ship of the dead was Loki. Freed from his shackles, together with him sailed the army of ghosts led by the goddess Hel. From Muspelheim rode the sons of Muspel, the fire giants. Led by Surtur, they raced toward the Bifrost Bridge, and the Rainbow Bridge crumbled under the weight of their army. From the iron wood emerged the Jotuns, and Hymir, the great giant, led them toward Asgard. From the east arrived the ship of the giant Loki with an army of monsters. All forces of chaos united against the gods. Heimdall, the guardian of the gods, saw the approach of the enemies and blew the Gjallarhorn. The sound of the horn swept through all 9 worlds, calling the gods to the final battle. The Aesir and Einherjar donned armor, took weapons, and exited Valhalla. 800 warriors through each of the 540 gates. A countless army of fallen heroes gathered over centuries. Odin rode in front in a golden helmet, with the spear Gungnir in his hand, on Sleipnir. Beside him was Thor in combat attire with Mjolnir. Freyr was without his sword, which he had given away for his bride. Tyr was one-handed but ready to fight. Heimdall had the sword Hofud, head. All the gods of Asgard Wistopili on the last campaign. They knew they were doomed, but honor demanded they meet fate with weapons in their hands, fighting until the end. The battle unfolded on the plain of Vigrid, the field of battle. This plain stretched for 100 leagues in every direction, a massive space for the greatest battle of all time. Odin battled Fenrir. The Allfather fought bravely, but the monstrous wolf swallowed him whole. Vidar, the silent son of Odin, took revenge immediately. He stepped with his special boot on Fenrir's lower jaw, grabbed the upper jaw with his hands, and tore the wolf in half. Thor met the world serpent Jormungandr. The god of thunder and the monster fought fiercely. Thor shattered the serpent's head with a blow of Mjolnir, but himself received a lethal dose of venom. He retreated 9 steps and fell dead. Freyr battled Surt, but without his sword, was killed by the fire giant. Tyr fought with the dog Garm, the guardian of Hel. Both killed each other. Heimdall met Loki in a final duel. The guardian of the gods and the trickster Odin's blood brother and traitor met in mortal combat. They killed each other, putting an end to the long history of enmity. Garm the dog broke his chains and fought with Tyr until mutual destruction. All the great gods fell in battle. The Einherjar fought valiantly but were overwhelmed by the superior forces of the giants and the dead. The field of Vigrid was drenched in blood and littered with the bodies of gods, heroes, and monsters. When the battle ended, Surtur raised his flaming sword high above his head. Fire engulfed everything. Asgard burned. Midgard turned to ash. Yggdrasil caught fire and collapsed. The seas boiled. The sky cracked, and the earth plunged into the waves. The old world perished completely. Only darkness and emptiness remained, but this was not an absolute end. After the destruction, rebirth began. From the sea rose a new earth, green, fertile, and beautiful. In the fields, grain grew of its own accord without needing to be sown. The sun bore a daughter before being swallowed, and this new star illuminated the new world. The surviving gods gathered on the plain of Idavol, where Asgard had formerly stood. Vidar and Vali, sons of Odin, survived the catastrophe. Magni and Modi, sons of Thor, arrived with their father's Mjolnir. They would use the hammer to protect the new world. Balder and Hod returned from Hel, the reconciled brothers. Hoenir, who had survived everything, performed a sacrificial divination and predicted a glorious future. The gods found golden gaming boards in the grass left over from the old world, a symbol of continuity between the perished and the new era. 2 humans survived the catastrophe, having hidden in the grove of Hodmamir. Their names were Lif, life, and Lifthrasir, life-yearning. They fed on morning dew and preserved their lives while the world burned around them. From this pair, a new humanity would descend that would settle the renewed earth. These people would be better, purer, and wiser than their ancestors. They would live in peace and justice. A beautiful hall would exist in the new world Gimli, protected from the fire, with a roof of pure gold. There, righteous people and gods would live. Another hall, Sindri, would be in the mountains of Nidafjöll, all made of red gold. There, good and honest people would find refuge. But there would also be a dark hall, Nastron Times, shore of corpses, for evildoers, where venom drips from the roof, snakes coil in the walls, and the dragon Nidhogg gnaws on the bodies of oathbreakers and murderers. Ragnarok was not an end of time, but a transformation, a cleansing of the world with fire and water. Everything imperfect, vicious, and old had to burn so that the new could be born. This was not the linear eschatology of Christianity with a final judgment and an eternal heaven or hell, but a cyclical concept of eternal return. The world perished to be reborn better. The gods died, but their descendants created a new, just order. Humans perished, but a new pair began the history of humanity anew, already knowing their ancestors' mistakes. This cycle could repeat forever. Each world carried within itself the seeds of its own destruction, but also the seeds of rebirth. The concept of Ragnarök reflected the Norse observation of nature, where death and birth are inextricably linked, where winter is replaced by spring, where new life grows from the ashes. Scandinavian mythology was not a frozen system of dogma. It developed and changed over centuries, reflecting the changes in Viking society. In the 7th century, the era of Viking expansion began. Norsemen set off on distant campaigns, discovering new lands, trading, and pillaging across Europe. They reached Constantinople in the east, North Africa in the south, Iceland and Greenland in the west, and around the year 1000, Leif Erikson landed in North America, which he named Vinland. These voyages expanded the horizons of the Scandinavians but also strengthened their adherence to their native gods. In foreign lands, the Vikings held to their faith, built altars to Thor and Odin, and offered sacrifices before battles. The faith of the Aesir and Vanir supported them in dangerous voyages and bloody battles. However, over the centuries, the Scandinavians encountered Christianity more and more often. At first, it was the religion of enemies, the Franks, the Anglo-Saxons whom the Vikings pillaged. The Scandinavians saw rich churches and monasteries filled with gold and silver, weakly defended, for Christians considered it sacrilege to attack the house of God. For the Vikings, these were simply convenient targets. They killed monks, burned churches, and trampled crosses, not fearing the Christian God. But gradually, some Norsemen began to accept the new faith. This happened for various reasons. Traders were baptized to do business in Christian countries. Mercenaries serving Christian kings adopted the faith of their masters. Kings saw in Christianity a tool for centralizing power. The Christian church supported royal power, unlike pagan priests, who were often independent. The first Scandinavian king to accept Christianity was Harald Klak in Denmark. around 825. But his power was fragile, and Christianization did not take hold. The real conversion began in the 10th century. In Denmark, King Harald Bluetooth was baptized around 960 and began to build churches and invite missionaries. In Norway, Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson, at the end of the 10th and beginning of the 11th century, imposed Christianity with fire and sword. They destroyed sanctuaries, chopped down sacred groves, and killed or exiled those who refused to be baptized. Many Norwegians fled to Iceland, preserving their loyalty to the old gods. In Sweden, Christianization proceeded more slowly. The last pagan sanctuary in Uppsala was destroyed only at the end of the 11th century. Iceland accepted Christianity in the year 1000 through peaceful means, but under dramatic circumstances. At the Althing Times, General Assembly, a dispute flared up between Christians and pagans. It was heading toward civil war. Then both sides turned to the law speaker, Thorgeir Leosvetningagodi, a pagan known for his wisdom and justice. Thorgeir lay under a cloak and pondered for a day and a night. In the morning, he announced his decision. Iceland would accept Christianity as the official religion to avoid a schism, but pagans would be allowed to secretly perform old rites and offer sacrifices at home without witnesses. This was a compromise that prevented bloodshed but signified the end of the pagan era. Public cults of the Aesir and Vanir ceased. Sanctuaries were abandoned or turned into churches. Idols of gods were hacked and burned. Sacred groves were cleared, but the old faith did not disappear instantly. Secret sacrifices continued in remote places for centuries. Peasants continued to believe in Time's Landvitir, Huldafolk, trolls, and Alfar. They wore amulets with Thor's hammer under Christian crosses. Many names of gods were preserved in the names of the days of the week. Tuesday, Tyr. Wednesday, Woden, Odin. Thursday, Thor. Friday, Frigg, Freyja. Geographical names throughout Scandinavia preserve the memory of the gods. Thorslunda Times, Thor's Grove. Freyslunda Times, Freyr's Grove. Odense Times, Odin's Sanctuary. Old customs blended with Christian ones. The midwinter festival of Times, Yule Times, turned into Christmas but preserved many pagan elements. Feasting and decorating the home with greenery. The sacrificial boar of the Yule festival became the Christmas ham. Scandinavian mythology was preserved in literature thanks to the Icelanders. In the 13th century, when Iceland had already been Christian for 2 centuries, people appeared who wrote down the old myths. The main one among them was Snorri Sturluson, a poet, historian, and politician. He created the Times Prose Edda, a textbook for skalds, where he laid out in detail the myths of the gods and explained poetic images and metaphors. Snorri was a Christian, but he treated the old myths with respect, seeing them as the cultural heritage of his people. He did not believe in Odin and Thor as real gods, but he considered it important to preserve knowledge of them to understand ancient poetry. Thanks to his work, a coherent picture of Scandinavian mythology was preserved. The Times Poetic Edda, a collection of ancient songs about gods and heroes, was recorded at approximately the same time. These texts became the primary source of our knowledge about the northern gods. Sagas, recorded in the 13th and 14th centuries, also contained many mentions of pagan times. The Time Saga of Egil Skallagrimson, the Time Saga of Njal, the Time Saga of the people of Laxardal, and many others described life before and during Christianization. They preserved ideas about honor, fate, and relations with the gods. Although the sagas were written by Christians, they tried to objectively present the pagan past without distorting it significantly. Skaldic poetry, especially verses from the 10th and 11th centuries, preserved many mythological images and times complex metaphors based on myths. Gold was called Freyja's tears, battle the storm of swords, a ship the horse of the sea. To understand these kennings, one had to know the myths, and therefore they were passed from generation to generation. Archaeology confirms and complements literary sources. Findings of amulets with Thor's hammer, figurines of gods, and runestones with images of mythological scenes show exactly how the Scandinavians imagined their gods. Viking burials with weapons, ships, sacrificial animals, and slaves illustrate their belief in the afterlife. The stone from Hunnestad in Skåne depicts Sleipnir with 8 legs and a rider likely Odin. The Gosforth cross in England shows scenes of Ragnarök. The Oseberg ship in Norway, where a noblewoman was buried around 830, is decorated with carved images possibly related to the journey into the afterlife. These artifacts allow us to see the pagan faith not only through the texts of Christian times but through the material culture of the Vikings themselves. The influence of Scandinavian mythology on European culture has been significant. The Norse, who settled across Europe, brought their myths to other lands. In England, where the Scandinavians ruled part of the country in the 9th and 10th centuries, many Scandinavian words and names entered the English language. In Normandy, the descendants of the Vikings preserved the memory of their northern origin, although they adopted the French language and Christianity. In Kievan Rus, where the Rurik dynasty of Scandinavian origin ruled, northern gods were honored alongside Slavic ones. The name Igor comes from the Scandinavian times Ingvar, and Oleg from times Helgi. The Varangian Guard in Byzantium consisted of Scandinavians who preserved their culture and faith, even while serving an Orthodox emperor. In the 19th century, there was a revival of interest in Scandinavian mythology. Romanticism, with its interest in the national past, folk culture, and the Middle Ages, turned to northern myths. The German composer Richard Wagner created the opera cycle times The Ring of the Nibelung times based on Germanic and Scandinavian legends about Sigurd and the cursed gold. His gods and heroes became known to the whole world. Scandinavian artists depicted scenes from the Edda, and writers created works on mythological themes. In the 20th century, Scandinavian mythology inspired a multitude of fantasy authors. J.R.R. Tolkien used elements of Eddic cosmology and images of dwarves in his works. Modern mass culture actively exploits images of Scandinavian gods in films, comics, and games, often simplifying and distorting them, but maintaining interest in ancient myths. Scandinavian mythology is important not only as cultural heritage, it represents a unique view of the world, different from Mediterranean and Middle Eastern traditions. Scandinavian gods are not all-powerful and not immortal. They struggle with fate, which is stronger than they are. They know they are doomed to perish, but they continue to fight, for honor and duty are more important than life. This concept of heroic pessimism, the acceptance of inevitable fate with courage, deeply reflects the worldview of the northern Germanic peoples. In a harsh climate, where survival required constant effort, where any year could be hungry, where the sea could take one's life at any moment, such a philosophy was natural. A human cannot control fate, but they can control their behavior in the face of fate. Honor, loyalty, courage, these are what remain when everything else is lost. Scandinavian mythology shows the world not as a cosmos opposed to chaos, but as a temporary order constantly besieged by forces of destruction. The gods are not the creators of everything that exists. They themselves are part of creation, having emerged from a primordial substance. They established order by killing Ymir, but know that this order is not eternal. Giants are not absolute evil. Many of them are wise. Gods take giantesses as wives, without which there would be no Thor. Loki, the product of chaos, lives among the gods and helps them until the very end. This ambivalence, the lack of a clear division into absolute good and evil, distinguishes northern mythology from many other religious systems. It is closer to the real complexity of the world, where good and evil are often intertwined, where there are no simple answers, where a hero can be cruel and a villain noble. The study of Scandinavian mythology continues. New runic inscriptions and archaeological finds are constantly being discovered that complete our picture. Researchers try to reconstruct exactly how pagan rites were performed, what sacrifices were offered, and what sanctuaries looked like. Answers are not always clear. Sources are often contradictory. Much has been lost forever. But even the fragmentary knowledge we possess opens up a rich and complex world of beliefs that shaped the lives of the Scandinavian peoples for over 1,000 years. This world was not primitive or barbaric, as Christian chroniclers sometimes depicted it. It was a complex religious system that answered the fundamental questions of human existence. Where did we come from? Why is the world the way it is? What awaits us after death? How should one live to remain worthy in the eyes of the gods, ancestors, and descendants?